This is Mr. DarXnights, and tonight I'm going to tell you a story that begins in the woods. A story wrapped in silence, sorrow, and snow. One that has puzzled police, haunted a city, and kept it secret for nearly 70 years. Close your eyes now, take a breath, and listen closely. This is the story of the boy in the box. It was a cold February morning in 1957 when the wind moved strangely through the trees of Fox Chase, a quiet, wooded patch on the northeastern edge of Philadelphia. The air was brittle, the trees bare, and the earth still frozen from a long, unrelenting winter. A place where time itself seemed to pause, where even the birds held their breath. A college student, hoping to check his rabbit traps, though trapping was illegal in those woods, wandered deep into the thicket, far from any homes or paved roads. He moved quietly, carefully, and just as he reached a clearing, something odd caught his eye. There it was, a cardboard box, sitting near the edge of the road, slightly tipped, soggy from melting snow. Most would have passed it by, mistaking it for trash. But this boy, he felt something strange in his chest, a tingle, like the world had suddenly gone quiet around him. When he stepped closer and looked inside, everything in his world changed. It wasn't trash. It wasn't something forgotten. It was someone. Inside the box, wrapped loosely in a worn plaid blanket, was the lifeless body of a young boy. Naked, bruised, and small. No older than 4. His pale skin was cold. His hair looked like it had been freshly cropped, uneven in some places as though cut in haste. His eyes were closed, his face calm, as if he'd only just fallen asleep. The student fled. He didn't report it right away. Fear, guilt, or disbelief, no one ever really knew why. Some said he didn't want to get in trouble for the traps. Others believed he simply couldn't process what he had seen. Days passed. Then another man, searching the area for a stray girl from a nearby home, found the same box. And this time he called the police. The scene was quickly cordoned off. Detectives arrived. Reporters came. And suddenly, the stillness of the woods was replaced with sirens, flashbulbs, and the voices of men asking impossible questions. Who was this child? Where had he come from? Who left him here, in a box, like garbage? There were no answers. No missing person reports matched the boy's description. No neighbors had seen anything. There were no fingerprints on the box. Nothing about the child's clothes or the blanket gave any clue to his identity. Just a body, bruised and battered, placed in the woods like a terrible secret. The box itself had once held a baby's bassinet. It had been sold by J.C. Penney. Investigators traced it. Over 12 of them sold in the area, but none of the leads panned out. The box, like the boy, had become a dead end. The child's injuries told their own story. Faded bruises, a small, healing surgical scar on his ankle, another on his groin, possibly from a circumcision, malnourishment, overgrown fingernails. It looked as if he hadn't been cared for, but also like someone had made a last-minute attempt to clean him up. His fingernails were trimmed. His hair had been hastily cut, as if someone had wanted to erase him, scrub him from the world. But why? Detectives named him America's unknown child. Flyers were printed. Photos of his face were placed in gas bills and handed out door to door. Mortuary artists created sketches of what he might have looked like alive. They tried everything: dental records, fingerprint analysis, even hypnosis sessions with possible witnesses. But nothing came. No name, no family, no one looking for a missing boy that matched. He had appeared like a ghost, and now he had become one. Months passed, then years. Detectives obsessed over the case. One in particular, named Remington Bristow, refused to give up. He kept a small shrine for the boy in his office, returning to the case again, and again like a man trying to remember a dream that always slipped through his fingers. Bristow believed the boy had come from a foster home nearby. He went undercover at social functions, posing as a potential donor, asking questions, taking mental notes. But there was no proof, nothing concrete, just whispers, just instinct. By the time a decade had passed, the world had changed. People moved on. But the boy, he remained, alone in an unmarked grave, buried by police and paid for by donations. His tombstone read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." Some nights, people would leave flowers, a stuffed animal, a candle, as if somehow they believe he might still be waiting for someone to remember his name. But no one ever came forward. Not a single soul claimed to know the boy. And still the mystery deepened. Years became decades, and still the boy without a name haunted the conscience of a city that could never quite forget him. Though his story faded from headlines, it never left the minds of those who saw his face, pale, still, frozen in time. They had given him many names over the years. The Fox Chase Boy, the boy in the box. But the one that stayed, the one whispered like a prayer over his unmarked grave, was America's unknown child. And for a while, that was all he would be. Detective Remington Bristow never stopped looking. He retired, aged, and yet never fully stepped away from the case. He carried the boy's face in his wallet, in his dreams, and often said the child had somehow become his own, that he saw him in the eyes of strangers, that he felt him in quiet places, whispers in the woods, cold air in closed rooms. Bristow was convinced the answer lay close to home. He believed someone knew, someone in the neighborhood, someone who had seen but stayed quiet. He once followed a lead to a foster home about a mile from where the box was found. The home had a history of abuse, whispers behind closed doors, but nothing he could prove. He even went so far as to track down the family that ran it years later, hoping for a confession. But they denied everything. Still, Bristow believed. In 1998, for decades after the boy was found, Bristow died, his life's work unfinished. But others picked up where he left off. The Vidic Society, a group of retired detectives, profilers, and forensic experts, took on the case. They were used to cold cases. But this one chilled them to the bone. Technology had changed since 1957. Now they had DNA. They exhumed the boy's body, carefully, respectfully, and extracted a profile. They hoped to match it with missing children databases, hoping science could find what paper trails and legwork could not. But the DNA matched no one. Still nameless. Still alone. They reconstructed his face using forensic clay, giving life to the skull that had remained silent for half a century. They released new sketches, shared his image across the internet. But again, no one came forward. No mother, no father, no family member with a photo or memory of a missing little boy. It didn't make sense. Children don't vanish without someone noticing. Someone must have loved him, or at least known of him. That's when the confessions began. Anonymous letters, phone calls, rumors, people who said they knew what happened, but never enough to prove anything. One call stood out. A woman, her name was never officially released, but she became known as M, came forward with a strange, haunting story. She claimed her mother had purchased the boy, yes, purchased him from his birth family, that he had been kept in their basement, abused, punished with the smallest things. That one day, he threw up his dinner, baked beans, and her mother, in a fit of rage, slammed his head against the wall until he went still. The baked beans detail chilled detectives. The boy's autopsy had shown remnants of baked beans in his stomach, an unusual fact not widely known. M said her mother then cut the boy's hair, cleaned his body, and wrapped him in a blanket. She drove with M to Fox Chase and placed the body in the box. It sounded plausible, but M had mental health issues. Her story changed. There was no physical evidence to support her tale. No names, no photographs, just words, just pain. The police couldn't confirm or deny her account. And so, Again, the trail went cold. Time passed. The world changed. But the boy's face remained the same. Frozen in 1957. More theories followed. Some believed he had been raised as a girl, that his unusual haircut and certain surgical scars pointed to gender reassignment. Perhaps a child unwanted by conservative parents in a time of deep cultural stigma. But no proof, just speculation. Others believed he had been abandoned by travelers, maybe a family living off-grid or passing through town in the dark. Maybe they weren't from Philadelphia at all. Maybe he was just dropped there, like a final act of despair. Still others believed he had lived nearby, that someone in Fox Chase saw something but kept it buried. What chilled many was this. When police released the boy's photos in 1957, photos of his face, his ears, even his body, they received hundreds of leads. But one stood out. A woman reported seeing a young boy weeks before the body was found. She said he was walking along the road, barefoot, looking scared, looking lost. She stopped, rolled down her window, but he said nothing, just stared, his eyes pleading. She kept driving. Later, she wondered, was that him? She couldn't be sure. That one moment, if it was him, could have been his last chance. And yet, no one came. Others, too, remembered odd things. One man said he heard cry in the woods, not far from where the box was found, that the cries lasted for hours. But he assumed it was an animal. A fox, perhaps. He went back to sleep. It was winter, after all. Who was a child crying the cold? The box itself, an empty bassinet container, was traced back to a local store. 12 had been sold in the area. Investigators followed every one, every receipt, every address. Nothing matched. The boy had no toys, no clothes, no items to call his own. He had no one. His ears were slightly deformed. His eyes, a pale blue. His legs bore signs of old bruises, possibly beatings. His fingerprints were taken, but there was no match. Even in death, he remained hidden. Eventually, the public lost interest. Other stories came, other horrors. But for those who worked the case, they never forgot him. They visited his grave, talked to his photograph. One detective kept his image on the dashboard of his cruiser, said it reminded him that not all crimes are solved, that some are carried in the heart, not in the court. Then came a twist. In 2016, investigators again exhumed the boy's body. Technology had advanced. DNA testing had become more precise, more powerful. They wanted to try something new, genetic genealogy, the same tool that had captured the Golden State Killer. And this time it worked. Using a sample of the boy's DNA, investigators constructed a genetic profile and uploaded it to public ancestry databases. Bit by bit, they found distant cousins, names on family trees. And slowly, they worked backward, building a line of descent like a staircase winding through time. In 2022, 65 years after the boy was found, they had a name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13th, 1953. For years old when he died, he had parents, a family, people who had known him. But even with his name, the mystery deepened. Why hadn't he been reported missing? Why did no one speak of him for all those years? The police contacted his surviving relatives, but answers were scarce. His mother had passed away. His father had remarried. Some family members claimed they never even knew he existed. Others stayed silent. The record showed Joseph was born at a local hospital, but shortly after, he disappeared from public view. No school records, no medical records, no childhood photographs, as if he had been erased. His identification brought both relief and heartbreak. He was no longer unknown. But still, no one knew what happened to him. Who hurt him? Who placed him in that box? And why? One theory suggests he may have lived with his mother's family, raised in secrecy. Others think he may have been passed between relatives, never truly wanted, never truly safe. His death, intentional or accidental, might have been covered up to avoid scandal. But no arrests were made, no charges filed, because in the end, too much time had passed. Evidence faded, witnesses died, and the silence remained. They reburied Joseph under a new headstone. It read, Joseph Augustus Arelli, January 13th, 1953, February 1957, America's unknown child. May he finally rest in peace. People came to the funeral. Strangers, detectives, reporters, those who had followed his story for years. Some cried, some prayed, some simply stood in silence, because even though they now knew his name, they didn't know his story, and perhaps they never will. There's a certain stillness that comes with closure, but it wasn't the kind that made people feel peace. When Joseph Augustus Arelli's name was finally spoken aloud by investigators, 65 years after his body was found in that rain-soaked cardboard box, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an echo, a whisper from the past that carried more questions than it answered, because now they could call him by his name. They could put letters to a life. They could give the grave a proper marker. But the most painful part, the part no one liked to say out loud, was that it didn't change what happened. Joseph still died, still alone, still discarded in the woods like something forgotten. His identity had been reclaimed, but his story remained trapped in fog. Investigators stood before the cameras in 2022, announcing the name as if revealing a long-lost secret. Their voices wavered. Some couldn't look directly into the lens. The air around them felt heavy, because behind the suits and microphones were men and women who had carried this weight their entire careers. And though science had brought them to a name, justice was still missing. When they traced Joseph's genealogy, they found relatives, distant cousins, branches of a family tree that stretched across states. But the closer they got to his parents, the more silent things became. Joseph's mother, they learned, had lived her life quietly, passing away without ever acknowledging what had happened. Some claimed she had spoken of a child once. Others said she denied his existence entirely. His father, still living when the name was released, refused a comment. The public wanted answers. People asked, how could a child disappear without anyone noticing? How could no one file a missing person report? No birthday parties. No pediatric records. No school enrollment. As if, from the moment he was born, he had been marked for disappearance. Theories multiplied again, this time more informed, but just as haunted. One story suggested Joseph had been born into scandal, that his mother was young, unmarried, and pressured to give him away, that he ended up in a private arrangement, perhaps with relatives or a quiet couple paid to raise him discreetly. In the 1950s, such secrets were common. Shame was currency, and children born out of wedlock were sometimes treated like shadows, moved around, forgotten. Another theory, darker, suggested he was abused by a family member, that his life was a series of silences and bruises, that when he died it wasn't an accident, but an act of desperation, that someone in his family chose shame over justice. A cover-up, a cardboard box, a wooded road at night. No one was ever arrested. The detectives said there were people who knew the truth, people who had chosen, for decades, not to speak. Some perhaps out of fear, others out of guilt. Some may have gone to their graves without ever uttering a word. And so Joseph remained what he had always been, a presence more than a person, a symbol, a child without a voice, carried forward by the voices of others. What stayed with most people wasn't the facts of the case. It was the image, that haunting face, wide blue eyes, flattened hair, bruises like fingerprints from the past. People across generations saw that photo and felt something, a connection, a need to know him, to hold him, to rewrite his ending. He had become part of American folklore, not the cheerful kind, The tragic kind. The kind whispered at night between detectives and mothers and radio hosts. His case had been featured in countless documentaries, true crime podcasts, books, and forums, each one peeling back layers, hoping for light. And even now, even after we knew his name, people still asked, what more was there? Forensic genealogists continue to trace his lineage, hoping a cousin, a sibling, someone, anyone might step forward with a memory, a photograph, a story, but mostly they were met with silence. And in that silence was a kind of confirmation that someone had buried the story on purpose, that Joseph's life and death were casualties of shame so deep it outlived those who caused it. The medical examiner's records described his body in painful detail. Small frame, malnourished, evidence of heel fractures, suggesting previous injuries. He had been bathed before being placed in the box, his nails trimmed, his skin clean. Whoever left him there hadn't been rushing. They had taken time. Time to clean, time to prepare, time to erase. That detail, the bathing, haunted the original investigators more than any other, because it suggested something deeply unsettling: care. Not affection, not love, but care. A ritual, a final attempt to present him as something innocent, pure, untouched. As if someone wanted the world to see Joseph as a child, not a victim. It was almost worse than cruelty. It was performance. And now that performance had outlived almost everyone involved. But the grave was different now. Where once there had been a small headstone reading only, Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy, there now stood a polished marker etched with his name. People left flowers, teddy bears, notes. Some addressed him as Joey. Others simply said, "We know you now." One woman left a toy car and a handwritten card that read, "You are not forgotten, not anymore." It had been decades since he died, and still, strangers were mourning him. In a way, he had more family now than ever before. And yet, every anniversary, every story retold, brought new pain, because knowing his name didn't explain why. And in that gap, in that aching silence, lived all the worst possibilities. There are those who believe the truth is still out there, that an old letter will surface, that a grandchild will stumble upon a confession, a diary, a box of photographs with one missing, that someone, somewhere, is waiting to unburden a memory. And maybe they are, but time is cruel. Time forgets. And Joseph was already forgotten once. The forest where he was found has changed. What was once remote and wooded is now dotted with development, roads, traffic. But if you visit the place, if you walk just far enough off the main path, you can still find that cold wind, that hush in the trees, as if the woods remember what we try to forget. A few years ago, a group of school children placed paper lanterns at the site. One child read a poem she wrote for Joseph, though she had never known his name when she wrote it. She said she felt like he had been waiting for someone to notice, to speak, to remember. That's what Joseph became, a reminder of all the forgotten. In a country full of unsolved cases, lost children, and faded files, he became the symbol of the unanswered cry, the child who never got to grow up, who never had a birthday party, who never got a first day of school, a scraped knee, a bedtime story, only cold earth and silence. And now a name. The legacy of Joseph Augustus Zarelli is not one of closure. It's one of vigilance. His case reminded investigators that no file is ever too old, that every child deserves to be named, that some ghosts only rest when we speak them aloud. Podcasters tell a story with reverence. Documentaries end with his photo, fading in and out like a spirit. And every few years, someone new discovers a case. A young detective, a curious student, a genealogist looking for a project. And once again, Joseph lives in their thoughts, in their search. He becomes real again, because that's all he ever wanted. To be known, not as the boy in the box, not as a mystery, But as Joseph, there are still records sealed by the courts, names redacted, stories unfinished. Some people believe the full truth will come out one day, that before the final generation passes, someone will give voice to what happened behind that closed door in 1957. Until then, his grave remains lit by candles, visited by strangers, remembered by the city that once forgot. Philadelphia may not have saved Joseph, but now it won't let him go. And as you close your eyes tonight, as the darkness settles and the world quiets down, remember Joseph's face. Not the bruises, not the box, but the child beneath it all. The one who laughed once, who ran, who maybe dreamed of being a fireman or a pilot, or a boy with a dog and a backyard. That boy lives somewhere in the silence. He's not alone anymore, because now you know his name, and sometimes that's where healing begins. This is the second story in our video tonight. Some stories don't fade. They linger in the silence, buried in pine needles, frozen in the early morning air. Ketty was the kind of place where silence felt normal, nestled deep in the Northern California wilderness, far away from the world's noise. But in April 1981, that silence was broken in the most brutal way imaginable. It began with a cabin. Cabin 28, to be exact. Sue Sharp had moved to Ketty just a year earlier. A single mother of 5, she was trying to rebuild her life, putting distance between her family and an abusive marriage. She wanted peace. She wanted her children to feel safe. That cabin, old and small as it was, offered a fresh start. But sometimes, even the quietest places hold echoes of things that don't want to stay buried. April 11, 1981. It was a Saturday. Cool spring air drifted through the valley, and the little resort town was just starting to wake up after a long winter. The Sharps were doing what most families did, living their lives in ordinary pieces. Sue was home with her children. Her oldest son, 15-year-old John, had his friend Dana Wingate over. They were teenagers, full of energy, always wandering in and out. That night, they went out together, hitchhiking to a nearby town to meet friends. They came back late. That part is known. The rest is a black hole. Sometime during the night, while the world outside slept peacefully beneath the stars, something awful happened inside Cabin 28. When morning came, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp, Sue's daughter, returned home from a sleepover next door. What she found when she opened the door would never leave her. The living room was a horror scene. Blood pooled on the floor, smeared across the walls. Her mother, Sue, lay near the couch, bound with medical tape and electrical wire. John and Dana's bodies were nearby, tied in the same way, bruised, beaten, stabbed. All 3 had been attacked with a knife and a hammer. It was ferocious, almost frenzied. Sheila ran, screaming, and yet, in a strange, haunting detail inside a back bedroom, 3 young children, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin, were found unharmed. They hadn't heard a thing. They'd slept through it all, just feet from where death had crept in. But there was one more thing. Tina Sharp, just 12 years old, was missing. She wasn't in the house. She wasn't in the yard. She was just gone. It didn't take long for the cabin to be swarming with deputies and state investigators. But Ketty wasn't a place built for murder. It didn't know what to do with a scene like this. The crime scene was poorly managed. Evidence was missed. The cabin wasn't sealed off properly. And worse, people began to talk. Whispers about what might have happened that night, about who might have been watching, who might have known the Sharp family just a little too well. Some said Sue had recently stood up to a man in town, someone with a temper. Others said Dana and John had gotten into an argument at a party that night. But the longer the hours dragged on, the less sense any of it made. There were clues. Sure, a bloody hammer, a knife from the kitchen, another knife found later in the trash outside. But nothing led anywhere conclusive. It was chaos. One of the strangest pieces of the puzzle came from Justin, one of the boys who'd been in the back room. In later interviews, he described a dreamlike memory of two men in the living room that night, one with a mustache, one with long hair. He said they argued, then screaming, then silence. Was it a dream or something more? The sheriff's department made a few moves. Two local men became early suspects, Marty Smart and his friend Bo. Marty had a history of violence. He lived just a few cabins down. His wife, Marilyn, was Sue Sharp's friend. That week, Marty had even complained to others that Sue was meddling in his marriage. He also owned a hammer, one that suddenly went missing. When questioned, Marty gave a strange statement. "I've paid for what I've done," he said. Cryptic, cold, but no arrest followed. Bo, a supposed ex-con with ties to organized crime, was also let go. The official story: there wasn't enough evidence. The cabin sat empty after that. Windows boarded, doors locked. The silence returned, but now it was heavier, tainted. Locals avoided walking too close. Children crossed the street rather than pass it. And still no sign of Tina. Her disappearance loomed like a shadow over the case. What happened to her that night? Was she taken before the murders? After? Was she a witness? A target? No one knew, and no one heard from her again until years later. It was 1984 when a skull was found in a rural area of Butte County, almost 100 miles from Keddie. Alongside it, scraps of clothing, a child's jawbone. They belonged to Tina. Just like that, hope was gone. But answers were, too. Who could have moved a child's body that far without being seen? Why wait 3 years? Some believe the killers returned and moved her to cover their tracks. Others think she was alive for a time, taken somewhere else. The questions only deepened and the silence grew thicker. In the decade that followed, the Keddie Cabin murders became a legend of sorts, an unsolved riddle whispered about in true crime circles, local bars, and bedtime stories meant to unsettle rather than soothe. The cabin itself, Cabin 28, was finally demolished in 2004. Locals had pushed for it for years. They said it was cursed, a blight on their quiet town. They wanted to forget, but you can't demolish memory. You can't tear down fear. The mystery of what happened that night still lingers like the scent of pine and smoke. The official case files remain open, with new detectives revisiting the scene, reviewing the files, studying the original mistakes. There was even a renewed interest in Marty Smart, who passed away in 2000. In 2016, a new sheriff went on record saying he believed multiple people were involved and that law enforcement knows who did it. But still no arrests, no convictions, just silence and questions. Why were the children left unharmed? Why take Tina? Why the overkill? Why the tape, the wire, the placement of the bodies? Some suggest it was personal, that Sue had seen something she shouldn't have, or said something to the wrong person. Others think it was ritualistic, symbolic, pointless brutality for its own sake. In either case, it didn't make sense, because that night, evil didn't come with a face. It came like a whisper, a shadow, a silent guest who slipped into the darkness and left behind a stain that could never be washed out. They say time heals all wounds, but in Keddie, time just left them open. Years passed, but the questions surrounding Cabin 28 only grew sharper, not duller. Every detail from that night became a puzzle piece, none of them fitting together neatly. The crime scene remained chaotic, the case file thick with dead ends, and every so often, someone would revisit it. Another detective hoping for closure, another journalist chasing a ghost. But the truth? The ghost was never gone. It lingered in the forest, in the splintered memories of the survivors, in the nightmares of a daughter who came home to find her world shattered in a single morning. Let's go back for a moment, back to the suspects. Back to the man the entire investigation seemed to orbit around, Marty Smart. Marty wasn't a stranger. He lived in cabin 26, not even 100 feet from the Sharps. He was a Vietnam vet, known for his temper, quick with words and quicker with his fists. His wife, Marilyn, was friends with Sue Sharp, and that might have been part of the problem. Some believe Sue had been trying to help Marilyn leave Marty, encouraging her to escape his abuse. To Marty, that would have been a betrayal. And in Ketty, small resentments could grow teeth. The night of the murders, Marty wasn't alone. He had company. Bo Babade, a man he claimed was a former Chicago police officer with murky past and rumored ties to organized crime. Marty and Bo were drinking that night, maybe more, and something about their movements, their statements after murders, they didn't sit right. Take this, for example. Marty told police that after returning home late, he and Bo saw nothing unusual. But Marilyn told a different story, saying Marty was acting strange, that he burned clothes in the fireplace, that he was suddenly obsessed with the murders, listening to news reports over and over, making comments that chilled her. He even told a therapist once, "I killed 3 people. I didn't have to, but I did it." That therapist, bound by confidentiality, never went to the police, not until years later. And by then, the trail was already cold. Bo left town shortly after the murders. Marty followed soon after. It wasn't suspicious, not exactly, but it wasn't comforting either. They vanished like smoke. And with them, maybe when the truth. You might think someone would crack eventually. Someone always talks, right? But Ketty had changed. People were scared. Some would want to remember. Others remembered too much. Then there was a boy, Justin Smart, Marty's stepson. He'd been one of the children in that back room, just feet from the murders. Over the years, his story changed. At first, he claimed he'd slept through it. Then came the dreams. Then fragments. He spoke of 2 men, of a struggle, of blood. In one version, he said he saw it all, standing silent in the shadows as his friend's family was murdered, that he'd seen his stepfather and Bo commit the act. But was it memory or something planted? Justin's account was always hazy, filtered through a child's fear and a therapist's interpretation. Nothing clear enough to charge anyone. Nothing solid enough to hold up in court. It was maddening. Imagine frustration of knowing the likely suspects, of having motives, connections, behavior that screamed guilt, but no definitive evidence. The sheriff's department botched the early investigation. Leads were ignored. Evidence disappeared. Tapes were erased. Reports went missing. And still, people asked, why? Why kill Sue Sharp? Why target John and Dana? Why leave the other children unharmed? Why take Tina? That last question haunted investigators most of all. Tina was the puzzle piece that didn't belong. If this was a crime of rage, a moment that spiraled out of control, why remove the only child who couldn't identify the attackers? Unless she could. Unless she had. Some believed Tina witnessed the murders and was taken to keep her quiet. Others believed she was the intended target all along, and the rest was collateral. Then, of course, came the discovery of her remains in 1984, a small skull in the woods, found by a bottle collector miles away in Butte County. Police were tipped off anonymously. Someone knew exactly where to look. When they arrived, they found more bones, scraps of clothing. They knew almost instantly who it was. Tina had come home, in a way, but she brought no answers with her. The evidence had deteriorated. No cause of death could be confirmed. No fingerprints, no DNA, no objects linking her to anyone. Just silence. Another open wound. Then came a wave of hope. Decades later, in the 2010s, the case was reopened. New sheriffs, new forensic technology, fresh eyes, and suddenly, the walls began to crack. Marty Smart's name resurfaced. So did Bo's. So did new pieces of evidence. Old items found in sealed boxes, overlooked for years. Among them, A handwritten note from Marty to Marilyn, apologizing for everything, talking about the murders, talking about Sue. Then came the discovery of a second hammer, found in a pond near the cabin site, a hammer that matched the wounds. Had someone tried to dispose of it? Had it been thrown away in panic? The new investigators believed it was the murder weapon. They believed Marty and Bo were responsible. They believed others in law enforcement knew and chose to stay quiet. It was a heavy accusation, but no arrests followed. Marty was dead. Bo was dead. And the people left behind? They were left with shadows. For Sheila Sharp, life after the murders was a long road paved with grief and silence. She grew up, moved away, tried to rebuild, but the past has a way of bleeding through the cracks. Every interview she gave carried the weight of trauma, the guilt, the horror of being the one who walked into that room, of leaving that night, and being the only one who came back. In her words, "I lost my family that day. I lost my childhood." No one could argue with that. And the cabin? Cabin 28 stood for over 2 decades after murders, weathered, rotting, a reminder no one wanted. Some claimed they heard things inside, saw shadows, lights flickering when no one was home. Eventually, in 2004, it was torn down, not to erase the past, but because some things are too heavy to leave standing. Still, even with the building gone, the legend of the Ketty Cabin murders lives on. In books, documentaries, podcasts, whispers on quiet roads in Northern California. Everyone has a theory. Everyone has a version. Some say it was a drug deal gone wrong. Others believe it was planned, a hit. Some say Marty acted alone. Others insist there were 3 people that night. The truth? We may never know. But here's what we do know. 3 people died violently. 1 little girl vanished and was found years later, discarded in the woods. No one paid for it. No trial. No justice. Only silence. And silence, when left long enough, becomes something else entirely. It becomes legend. It becomes horror. It becomes a bedtime story that isn't meant to comfort, but to remind us that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they get away with it. And sometimes they're never truly gone. The case should have been closed long ago. It should have been written into the archives of solved tragedies, buried with justice, and remembered with peace. But the Ketty Cabin murders never received that privilege. Instead, it festered in silence, in confusion, and in the spaces between fact and fear. As the years stretched on, the story of Cabin 28 grew heavier, more complicated. New voices tried to make sense of what had long been broken. One of them was Gamberg, retired, then rehired, a man who'd been a deputy when the murders first occurred. In the 2010s, under a new sheriff, he was brought back to dig to the past and look for anything missed. He didn't expect to find much. Maybe some closure, maybe some dust-covered files. But what he found instead were cracks. Deep cracks in the foundation of the original investigation. Evidence mishandled. Statements ignored. Items never tested. It was like the entire case had been boxed away before it ever had a chance. And there, tucked inside a folder, was a copy of a letter. Marty Smart's letter. A confession that wasn't legally a confession, but emotionally it felt like one. "I've paid the price for your love," it read, "and now I bought it with 4 lives." 4 lives. That was a number that never left investigators alone, because for decades it had always been 3. Sue, John, Dana. But Marty's note said 4. And Tina? She was a 4th. That line was enough to pull the case back into the light. Forensic testing resumed. Evidence, once thought lost, was re-examined. Old tape reels were played again. Every statement was reread, every suspect reevaluated. Marty Smart and Bo Babade remained at the center of it all. But the deeper they dug, the more it became clear. Someone helped them get away with it. The early 1980s weren't what they are now. Keddie was isolated. The sheriff's department was small. Protocols were looser, and connections, personal ones, could shape the outcome of everything. Some believe there had been a deliberate effort to shield the suspects. Marty had ties to the sheriff. Bo's past, supposedly as a former law enforcement officer, gave him a kind of unspoken immunity. And then there was the hammer. Years later, when it was recovered from a nearby pond, it matched the description of a missing weapon tied to the case. How it ended up there and why it took decades to find remained its own mystery. But it wasn't the only piece. There were bloody knives, unexplained footprints, witness statements from neighbors who heard muffled screams at night. One couple said they saw a dim light flicker in cabin 28 around 1:15 a.m. Another neighbor heard what sounded like a loud thump. Yet none of these accounts were ever properly followed up. It was as though the crime had been swallowed by the town itself. There were people who moved away from Keddie and never looked back. Others who stayed but never spoke of it. And then there were the children, those who lived through that night and carried the scars. Greg and Rick Sharp, Justin Smart. For a long time, their voices were quiet. But trauma has a way of changing shape over time. It resurfaces, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in sudden memories, sometimes in long pauses between answers during interviews. Justin especially struggled. He'd been just 12 at the time. His recollections were a blur of half-memories and therapy sessions. Sometimes he described seeing the murders happen. Other times he claimed it was a dream, but in one session he drew pictures. 2 men, weapons, blood. One of them looked like Bo, the other his own stepfather. It was never admissible in court, but it painted a chilling picture. By the time 40 years had passed, most of those involved had died. Marty, Bo, the original sheriff, even Dana's mother, who'd spent her life demanding answers, eventually passed with none. But new investigators refused to let the case disappear again. Gamberg and the current sheriff released public statements, saying they knew who did it. They believed Marty and Bo were responsible, and they believed others had helped cover it up. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a conclusion. They just didn't have a living suspect to charge. Still, the investigation remained open, and in the hearts of the victims' families, there was a bitter mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that someone had finally said it. Sorrow that it had come too late. For Sheila, the loss was layered. She didn't just lose her mother, her brother, her sister's friend. She lost a sense of safety, of trust, of the idea that justice would come to those who deserved it. Over the years, she tried to heal. She raised a family of her own. She spoke out. She wrote about her experience. But every time the calendar turned to April, the memories came back. The cabin might be gone, but she could still see it, still hear the silence that greeted her when she opened that front door, still remember the coldness in the air, the strange quiet of a home where something terrible had just happened. People often ask, why weren't they all killed? Why leave the younger children alive? Why take Tina and not the others? No one knows. Some believe the killers didn't realize the children were there. Others think it was deliberate, an act of control, of fear, or maybe they just weren't threats. The deeper question, though, is this: why did the case fail? Was it incompetence, fear, favoritism, or was it something darker? The truth might never be fully uncovered. And that's what makes the Keddie Cabin murders one of the most haunting, unsolved cases in American history. Because it wasn't just about who did it. It was about how easily it could have been solved, how close the answers were, how loud the silence became. Today, the site where Cabin 28 once stood is empty, overgrown. The wood is gone. The walls, the bloodstains, the broken furniture, all gone. But for those who remember, the cabin is still there in their minds, still frozen in that April night. still echoing with questions. And for those who hear the story for the first time, the feeling is always the same. A chill, a deep discomfort, a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happened. In the end, the Ketty Cabin murders aren't just a story of violence. They're a story of failure, of what happens when justice is delayed, when fear wins, when small towns keep big secrets, and of a night that should have been quiet, but became anything but. So if you ever find yourself driving through the Sierra Nevadas, through the old tracks and whispering trees of Plumas County, remember this. Some cabins hold warmth. Others hold something else. And Cabin 28, it held a secret that still hasn't finished telling itself. This is the third story of our video tonight. They call it the Highway of Tears. A stretch of road so quiet, so beautiful, that if you didn't know its history, you'd think it was just another peaceful ribbon cutting through the wilderness. Route 16 winds its way across British Columbia, reaching into the misty folds of the northwestern United States. Towering pines line both sides. The air smells like rain and dirt. It's the kind of place where people disappear without a sound. It started with one girl, then another, and before long, it wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was a pattern. Since the 1970s, over 80 women, most of them indigenous, have vanished or been found murdered along this highway. Some were last seen hitchhiking. Others were walking. Some were never seen again. No one could give a clear answer. No one knew how or why. And no one was looking hard enough. Locals called it what it was: a curse, a warning, a road that swallowed people. The police? For years they called it a tragedy. But it was more than that. Much more. The stories began to collect. One by one, each with its own ache, its own trail of sorrow. There was 12-year-old Monica Jack, last seen riding her bike near Nicola Lake in 1978. She was smiling, free. Her body wouldn't be found for 17 years. And her killer? It would take until 2014 before anyone was charged. A man named Gary Taylor Hanlon confessed to her murder during a covert operation. But by then, Monica had become just one name in a long, painful list. Then there was Ramona Wilson, 17, full of life. She vanished in 1994 while trying to hitch a ride to a friend's house in Smithers, British Columbia. Her remains were found a year later near an airport. No arrests were made. No one saw anything. No one admitted to anything. Just a mother left behind, holding on to a photo and a grave. And she wasn't the only one. Each story followed the same haunting rhythm. A girl would leave home, sometimes in broad daylight, and then nothing. Her name would echo across town. Posters would go up. Families would wait. The search would begin. Days would pass. Then weeks. Then years. Sometimes there were remains. Sometimes not even that. And the silence? It was deafening. But this wasn't just a Canadian tragedy. The Highway of Tears bled across borders. Into Washington. Into the deep forests and reservations of the northwestern United States. It stretched like a shadow, following logging roads and rivers, disappearing into the fog. One by one, lives were erased. There were theories. Of course, some blamed serial killers. Others blamed organized crime. Some whisper about trafficking rings, about dark secrets buried in remote towns and truck stops where no one asked questions. But the truth was even worse. No one really knew. And for years, the cases weren't even connected. It wasn't until families started speaking up, loudly, desperately, that authorities began to piece it together. There was a pattern, a route, a road, and women, mostly indigenous women, were dying along it. Still, even with that knowledge, justice moved slowly. Resources were limited. Leads were few. And for many of the victims, there wasn't even an official file until it was too late. You see, There's something else about the Highway of Tears. It's not just a place of violence. It's a place of invisibility. Many of the missing women came from marginalized communities, forgotten by governments, overlooked by police, abandoned by systems that were never built to protect them. And in the darkness of that highway, they became ghosts. There's one story that locals tell, especially truckers who drive the long night shifts through the forest. They speak of a woman in white. She appears suddenly on the side of the road, always alone, always barefoot. Her head is low. Her arms hang by her sides. Sometimes she raises one hand, as if asking for help. Those who stop say she vanishes before they reach her. Those who don't say they feel her eyes in their rear-view mirror for miles. Some believe she's a spirit. Others think she's all of them, a collective echo of every woman who was taken, every voice that was silenced. A few even say she's a warning. But whether ghost or grief, her presence is undeniable. And when the wind moves just right, you can hear it in the trees. The weight of sorrow, the stories that never found an ending. The Canadian government eventually launched an inquiry, a national investigation into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It was supposed to bring answers, bring change. But to this day, most families say the same thing. It wasn't enough. Too many names. Too little action. Too late. There were moments of hope, like when the RCMP arrested Cody Leijbokov, one of Canada's youngest serial killers, who was eventually linked to the deaths of 4 women. But even then, the numbers didn't match. For it wasn't enough. Not even close. There were too many questions left unanswered. Who killed Ramona? Who took Maureen? What happened to Alberta Williams? The list went on. And the fear? It never left. Women still warn each other not to hitchhike along Route 16. Parents still double-check locks. Still tell their daughters to stay off that road after dark. And some towns, they just don't talk about it at all. Silence has become its own kind of coping, but stories have a way of surviving. They pass through families, through whispers, through the eyes of mothers who lost too much. There's a mother who still walks along Route 16 every year, holding a sign with her daughter's face on it. She says she walks to remind people, to stop them from forgetting, because forgetting is the real danger. That's how it keeps happening. That's how the road stays hungry. And somewhere out there, someone still knows something. Someone saw something. Someone stayed quiet. Maybe they're still out there, driving those long, empty roads, watching for the next girl who looks lost. Or maybe they're hiding in plain sight, in a town that's too afraid to look closely. But the Highway of Tears hasn't forgotten. It remembers every name, every face. And it waits, because one day, the truth will come out. And when it does, it won't just be a headline. It will be a reckoning. A voice long silenced, finally speaking. And a road that might finally stop claiming the lost. The Highway of Tears doesn't scream. It whispers. The road itself never changed. Still 2 narrow lanes stretching to the wild beauty of British Columbia. Still flanked by pine trees that seem to listen. But the silence along it has become unbearable. It isn't just the missing. It's the feeling that something's watching. Something unsolved, something unfinished. Every town along Route 16 has a story. Every family has a scar. In Prince Rupert, they remember Alberta Williams. She was 24 when she vanished in 1989 after leaving a bar with friends. She was happy, full of dreams. Her body was found a few weeks later near the highway, strangled, left like trash. Her case remained cold for decades, until a retired RCMP officer named Gary Kerr reopened it and said he believed the killer had been interviewed and let go. They had him, and they let him go, just like that. You hear that kind of story once. It haunts you. You hear it dozens of times, same patterns, different faces, and begins to feel like something darker, something deliberate. But let's step back to the early years, before the term Highway of Tears even existed, before journalists caught on, before police were pressured. There were girls going missing and no one connecting the dots. No maps, no databases, just local rumors and grieving families who were told to wait. Sometimes they were told their daughters had run away. Sometimes they were told the cases weren't related. And sometimes they weren't told anything at all. One family remembers the silence best. It was 1973. A young indigenous woman, only 19, didn't come home. They reported her missing. Police didn't look. She was never found. To this day, the family doesn't know if she was one of the highway's early victims. But they're certain of one thing. If she had been white, someone would have cared. This is what makes the Highway of Tears different from other unsolved cases. It's not just the horror, it's the indifference. The road itself, Route 16, is remote, yes, but that doesn't mean people disappear into thin air. These weren't strangers. These were daughters, sisters, mothers. They had names. They had favorite songs and worn-out shoes and friends waiting for them to come back. But when they vanished, it was like the world shrugged. Even now, police admit that if efforts had started earlier, if a task force had been assembled in the 70s instead of the 2000s, many of these women might still be alive. Let that settle for a moment. Decades of mischances. Decades of cold wind and fading posters. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police eventually launched Project EPANA in 2005, a special task force assigned to investigate the Highway of Tears cases. It focused on 18 specific incidents between 1969 and 2006, but the number was always debated. Indigenous communities insisted there were far more victims, at least 40, maybe more. Some say over 80. Project EPANA identified a few suspects. They looked at serial killers. They tracked down known offenders who had crisscrossed that part of the country over the years. One of the most chilling was Bobby Jack Fowler, a U.S. citizen with a long history of violent behavior. He'd been arrested for kidnapping, attempted rape, assault. He was in Canada during some of the Highway of Tears murders. DNA eventually tied him to one of the victims, Colleen McMillan, murdered in 1974. She was just 16. Authorities believe he may have been responsible for others, but he died in prison before he could be fully questioned. And even with his DNA linked, even with other potential connections, he didn't explain everything. Too many cases didn't fit. Too many killers, perhaps, or maybe just one with no trace. Then there are the truck stops, the logging camps, the lonely stretches between towns where cell phone signals vanish and the dark comes early. Many women were last seen near these places, hitchhiking, walking, trying to get to work or school or visit family. Public transportation in northern British Columbia is unreliable at best and non-existent in many rural areas. For years, young women had no choice but to walk or hitchhike. It was dangerous. Everyone knew that. But what else could they do? That's how this monster, whoever he was or they were, kept finding victims. He didn't have to lure anyone. They were already vulnerable, already in need, already ignored. You hear that over and over from the mothers, the cousins, the friends left behind. That if someone had just cared sooner, really cared, maybe the list would be shorter. There's a woman named Matilda who lost her niece in 1996. She says she still sees her sometimes, in dreams and flashes of memory. She doesn't trust the RCMP. Says she never did. Says she begged them to search sooner. But no one showed up for days. And by then, it was too late. Years later, when news crews began covering the Highway of Tears, something strange happened. People began to talk. Not just the families, but witnesses, locals, truckers. One man said he picked up a girl near Terrace in 1998. She seemed scared. Said she'd seen someone following her. He dropped her off safely, but she disappeared a week later. Another woman, who worked nights at a gas station, said she'd seen a man in a pickup talking to multiple indigenous girls on different nights. always around closing time. She gave a description. Nothing ever came of it. Leaves like that exist in piles of dusty folders and old tape recorders, stored away in police evidence lockers, some forgotten entirely. But they're real. They could still mean something. And then there are the rumors. Stories that don't make it into official reports. Stories shared around fire pits or whispered at town hall meetings when the cameras are gone. They speak of a man who drives a white truck with tinted windows, always spotless no matter the weather. They say he knows the woods better than anyone, that he never takes the same road twice, that he has a badge, maybe real, maybe fake, that he pretends to be a cop when he stops girls walking alone. They say if you see him, don't make eye contact, don't speak, just run. But who knows? Maybe he's just a myth, born from grief and fear and years of silence. Or maybe he's the reason the Highway of Tears is still claiming lives. There was one night, a cold, misty evening in 2004, when a driver called into the police, said he saw something strange. A figure standing in the road, just past a bend, pale dress, no shoes. He swerved, nearly crashed. When he got out to check, nothing, no woman, no footprints. But later, when he checked his dash cam, he saw something in the footage, just a blur, a flicker, and a pair of eyes, staring. The dash cam was damaged shortly after. Coincidence? Maybe, but the man who saw it never drives Route 16 at night anymore. He says it still feels watched. Always, some nights. If you pull over along the highway and listen closely, the silence grows thick. Heavier than air. It presses against your ears, like it's trying to keep something in. Locals say that's the sound of spirits, not resting, just waiting, because until justice comes, they can't move on, and neither can the living. There's a rest stop near Smithers where people have reported hearing whispers, soft, desperate voices calling for help in the dead of night. Workers have refused to clean there after dark. One woman says she heard someone say her name, even though no one else was around. That's what the highway does. It seeps in. It remembers every missing face. And it won't let you forget either. The road stretches on. Cold, endless, winding through the wilderness like a scar across the land. They call it Route 16. But locals, they call it something else. The Highway of Tears. Because when the wind cuts through the pines and the clouds hang low over the hills, it doesn't sound like wind at all. It sounds like sobbing, like grief frozen in time. And the truth is, this highway holds its secrets too well. Over the years, dozens of indigenous women have disappeared here. Young girls walking to school, mothers going to work, teens heading to visit friends. Some were found. Some were never seen again. And some were discovered long after the headlines faded. Bones in the woods, names on dusty case files. And almost all of them remain unsolved. There was Ramona Wilson, only 16. She was last seen hitchhiking in 1994 near Smithers. Her mother begged authorities to take it seriously. They didn't. Said she probably ran away, that she'd come back. 10 months later, a group of kids stumbled on her skeletal remains near the airport. Her family built a memorial cross there, painted it white, left flowers. Some nights, her mother says she hears Ramona's voice in her dreams, telling her it wasn't supposed to happen that way, that she trusted the wrong person, that she didn't mean to disappear, even if the world does. And still, no answers, just another name, another tear on the map. There's a feeling you get when you drive that stretch of highway at dusk. The light fades fast. The trees loom taller. Cell service disappears. And every so often you pass a hand-painted sign nailed to a tree, "Stop taking our sisters." Sometimes the signs are gone by morning. Sometimes they're replaced with newer ones, names written in fresh ink, dates scrawled in red. It's a reminder this isn't over. The violence hasn't stopped. The most chilling thing about the Highway of Tears isn't what we know. It's what we never will. There are stories, whispers shared in hushed tones, about a missing girl who reappeared for one night only. A trucker swore he saw her walking barefoot along the shoulder, shivering, lips blue. He offered a ride. She climbed into his cab, didn't say a word, just stared out the window. He drove her 20 miles into town. When he turned to ask where she wanted to go, she was gone. No sound, no trace, just a faint imprint of a hand on the foggy window. He didn't drive that road again. Others tell a figure in white who stands at mile marker 117, head bowed, arms outstretched. People say she appears on nights when the moon is full. Some claim she's an omen, warning drivers to turn back. Others believe she's one of the lost, trapped between this world and the next. You can laugh at the stories if you want, but if you talk to the families, the ones who waited a decade without answers, you'll hear a different kind of ghost story. One made of case numbers, closed files, unreturned calls, and time that eats away at truth like frost on a windshield. Let's talk about Nicole Hoare. She was 25 when she vanished in 2002 while hitchhiking near Prince George. Unlike many others, Nicole wasn't indigenous. She was white middle class, working a landscaping job for the summer. And when she disappeared, the coverage was massive. Posters everywhere. TV interviews. Full police involvement. For a brief moment, the Highway of Tears was national news. But what stung most was what that moment revealed. Because for years, dozens of indigenous girls had gone missing with little attention. And suddenly, with one white woman gone, the world noticed. The contrast was impossible to ignore. And so, families marched. They organized candlelight vigils, painted murals, held community meetings. They demanded answers, not just for Nicole, but for all the others. And still the answers never came. In 2016, Canada launched a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It was meant to bring justice, closure, change. But ask the families, and you'll hear frustration, delays, politics, empty promises. Some call it a start. Others call it a distraction, because meanwhile the road keeps taking. In 2021, another young woman vanished near the highway. Same story, different year, and nothing has changed. Some believe the killer, or killers, still walk free. Some say it's a conspiracy, that someone in law enforcement knew and looked the other way, that a network of predators used the remoteness of the area to cover their tracks, and others believe something older walks the woods, something ancient, something hungry. Elders from nearby First Nations communities speak of shadow spirits, of tricksters who were the faces of loved ones, of wendigos, creatures born of greed and cold and human suffering. They say when the land is soaked in too much grief, it begins to rot and something dark wakes up. One woman, a teacher, told the story of her sister, who vanished in 1999. The family held a vigil deep in the forest, near where her backpack was found. That night, she swears she saw a pale shape move between the trees, tall, thin, with no eyes. It stood still for 10 full minutes, watching, unmoving. No one else saw it. But from that day on, she says, the dreams began. Dreams of walking that highway forever and never finding the way home. She doesn't go into the woods anymore. The Highway of Tears is more than just a stretch of road. It's a mirror, a reflection of how easily we forget the one society pushes aside. Women who were told they were too poor, too brown, too remote to matter, but they mattered. They still do, and some nights, the road remembers them. You'll see flowers left on the shoulder, weather-beaten posters stapled to old telephone poles. The photos are faded, the smiles frozen, the eyes always searching. And then there are the drivers, the ones who say they saw her, just ahead, walking, alone. They flash their brights. She doesn't turn. They honk. She keeps walking. And when they finally pass, they look in a rearview mirror, and there's nothing there, only the empty road, and the trees, and the silence, a silence that screams, "This is the highway of tears." And it isn't done speaking yet. This is the fourth story in tonight's video. June 23rd, 1965. Houston, Texas. It was supposed to be just another welfare check. An elderly couple, Fred and Edwina Rogers, hadn't been seen for a few days. Their relatives grew concerned when the phone calls went unanswered. The house sat quiet on Driscoll Street, tucked inside a quiet neighborhood in the Montrose area. The curtains were drawn, the mailbox full. 2 Houston police officers were sent to investigate. What they found would send shivers through the entire city, and decades later, it still haunts anyone who dares to look too close. At first glance, the house was pristine, neat, clean, almost sterile. A strange silence hung in the air, heavy like the heat outside. The front door was locked, but the officers managed to find their way in through the back. Everything was in its place. No sign of struggle, no signs of forced entry. It was only when they stepped into the kitchen that the horror began to reveal itself. The officers opened the refrigerator and froze. Inside were shelves of what looked like meat, wrapped, neatly stacked, organized like a butcher's display. Only this wasn't beef or pork. And when one of the officers opened the vegetable drawer, he nearly dropped the flashlight. 2 human heads stared back at him. Fred and Edwina Rogers were dead, murdered, dismembered, stored inside their own refrigerator like leftovers. The Houston Police Department quickly sealed off the home. Crime scene investigators arrived, but nothing about the scene made sense. There was no blood in the kitchen, none on the floor, none on the counters. It was as if the bodies had appeared there magically, except for one problem. Someone had gone through great effort to clean, almost too much effort. Investigators followed the trail. Eventually, they discovered traces of blood leading to the bathroom. There, the tiles told a different story. Someone had butchered the bodies in the bathtub, cleaned the surfaces, wrapped the remains, and left them inside the fridge. It was cold, calculated, almost surgical. But something else disturbed detectives more than the gruesome method. It was the absence of someone. Fred and Edwina's son, Charles Rogers, a quiet, reclusive man in his 40s who lived with them, or more specifically, lived above them. Charles had his own space, an attic apartment with a separate entrance, the kind of arrangement that let him exist inside the house without ever really being part of it. Neighbors reported they hadn't seen Charles in days. Some even forgot he lived there. The police climbed up to the attic, and what they found was emptiness. Charles was gone. His bed was made, his room neat, but the door had been barricaded from the inside. Not in panic, in strategy, like he wanted to buy time before anyone realized he'd left. The only strange thing left behind was a calendar, marked with a single word written in red across the date of June 20th. Killed. That was Father's Day, the day Fred and Edwina were murdered. Who was Charles Rogers? And why had he seemingly snapped? Digging into his background raised more questions than answers. Charles was no ordinary recluse. He'd once been a Navy pilot, a trained seismologist, a gifted student with fluency in multiple languages. He'd worked for oil companies, served his country, and yet something had driven him into isolation. By the 1960s, he rarely left the attic, communicated with his parents by slipping notes under the door, ate separately, refused to speak to neighbors. He became a ghost in his own home. Some described him as polite but cold, distant. Others said he was paranoid, obsessed with radio equipment, always fiddling with antennas on the roof. A man whose world had grown smaller and stranger with each passing year. But no one suspected he was capable of murder. And yet, all signs pointed to him. There were no signs of forced entry. No other suspects. Nothing stolen. No ransom note. Just two butchered bodies and a missing man who left behind nothing but a locked attic and a marked calendar. Forensic experts examined the remains. Fred had been bludgeoned with a claw hammer. Edwina had been beaten, then had her eyes gouged out. The brutality was personal, fueled by something deeper than rage. Hatred, maybe resentment, or something darker. Still, there were no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no witnesses. Charles had vanished completely. It was as if the earth swallowed him whole. Police issued a warrant, put out notices, spread his photo across the state. But there was no sign of him. Not in Texas. Not anywhere. For weeks, the city was gripped with fear and fascination. How could a man just disappear? Theories poured in. Some believed Charles had fled to Mexico. Others said he'd hidden in the bayous, let the swamps claim him. A few whispered that he never left at all, that he was buried beneath the house or sealed behind a wall. But searches came up empty. And then the house itself became a legend, the site of the icebox murders. Neighbors moved away. New owners refused to step inside. Eventually, the property was sold, demolished, and rebuilt. But something lingers on that stretch of Driscoll Street. A coldness, an echo, as if the past refuses to die quietly. To this day, no one knows what truly happened inside that house on Father's Day, 1965. No one knows where Charles went, or why he did it. But every so often, someone drives past where the house used to stand and feels a chill, a freezer door chill, like someone's watching from an attic that isn't there anymore, waiting, just out of reach, and just beginning to whisper. There's a reason this case never sat still. Not in Houston, not in the minds of investigators, and certainly not in the hearts of those who knew that quiet house on Driscoll Street. Once the news spread, once headlines blared about an elderly couple murdered and stuffed into their own refrigerator, something about the scene took root in American true crime lore. It wasn't just a horror, it was the silence that followed, the vacuum of explanation. A crime scene so clean it was surgical, a suspect so elusive he may as well have evaporated. And yet, people kept searching. One of them was Hugh Gardenia, a former homicide investigator with the Houston Police Department. Years after the case went cold, Gardenia admitted that Charles Rogers remained one of the most chilling missing persons cases he had ever handled. Because Charles hadn't just run. He'd planned it, carefully, painfully, which meant the murder, too, may have been planned far longer than anyone realized. Investigators started to dig into family dynamics, and what they found wasn't a picture-perfect household with a misunderstood son. Fred and Edwina Rogers were not kind people, at least not behind closed doors. Relatives and neighbors began speaking out, saying Fred had a long history of manipulation. Edwina, while quieter, was complicit. Fred had once been accused of fraud, shady business dealings, and severe emotional abuse. Charles, they said, had grown up under a heavy, suffocating hand, isolated, controlled, and by the time he was in his 30s and still living in that house, he wasn't just distant, he was desperate to disappear. People started wondering, could the murder of Fred and Edwina have been Charles's only way out? The idea that he may have spent months planning his escape took root. After all, his room was clean, organized. He had experience as a pilot, knowledge of navigation, fluency in several languages. He had worked as a seismologist in some of the most remote regions of the world. If anyone could vanish, it would be him. In the late 1970s, a theory emerged that captured the public imagination. Two Houston writers, Hugh and Martha Gardenia, co-authored a book called The Icebox Murders, which detailed an even darker theory, that Charles Rogers had not only murdered his parents, but had done so to sever ties to his past before entering a life of covert operations. They believed Charles was deeply involved with intelligence work, possibly even connected to the CIA. It sounded outrageous at first, but then came the JFK assassination theory. In the years following President Kennedy's death in 1963, conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed there were connections between key players in Texas, including seismologists, pilots, and contract agents. The Gardenias proposed that Charles Rogers may have been a contract pilot for the CIA, operating under multiple aliases, that Fred and Edwina had uncovered something about his secret life and threatened to expose him. According to their theory, Charles eliminated them to sever the risk, and then disappeared, possibly aided by intelligence connections, into Central or South America. No proof ever emerged. But what disturbed readers wasn't the theory itself. It was how plausible it sounded when stacked next to facts. Charles had the skills, the motive, the cold detachment, and most chilling of all, the silence. In all the years since the murders, not a single confirmed sighting of Charles Rogers has ever occurred. Not one. No fingerprints. No financial records. No paper trail. It's almost as if the man never existed beyond that attic. Even when private investigators followed leads to Honduras, Venezuela, and even Paraguay, they found nothing but speculation. One retired PI claimed to have tracked Charles to a remote part of Mexico in the 1980s, living under a new name, working as a mechanic. He said the man never spoke, avoided cameras, and left the village after 2 years. But that, too, was never confirmed. Back in Houston, the case file aged like bones buried in frost. By the 1990s, the house on Driscoll Street had been long demolished. A new home stood in its place, modern, sleek, and lifeless. Neighbors avoided talking about what had come before, but the stories never stopped. Some claimed the new homeowners heard strange sounds at night, refrigerators that made no sound, doors that creaked open on their own. One renter swore he saw an elderly man standing in the corner of the kitchen, only to vanish when the light flicked on. Whether true or not, the legend of the Icebox murders became something darker than just an unsolved case. It became a haunting, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't come out of the woods or crawl up from the basement. Sometimes they live in the attic, eat dinner in silence, slip notes under doors, and smile with cold eyes when no one is looking. Years passed. Charles was officially declared dead in 1975, 10 years after he vanished, but no body was found. The declaration was administrative, a necessity, closure on paper. But the living never forgot. One forensic profiler in the early 2000s proposed that Charles was a kind of offender who doesn't kill often, but when he does, the violence is sudden, shocking, and final. That the Icebox murders weren't a beginning, but an end. The final act of a man who had been unraveling for years. But what was he unraveling from? That question remained unanswered. Old police reports revealed a strange pattern. Charles had been obsessed with radio frequencies. In the months before the murders, he had dismantled and rebuilt several antennas. Some neighbors said they heard strange static sounds coming from his attic at night. Long bursts of numbers read aloud in different languages. If true, that behavior mimics number stations, shortwave radio transmissions used by intelligence agencies to send encrypted messages. Could Charles have been receiving orders? Or giving them? Or was it just madness? Broadcast into the dark by a man losing his grip? Investigators tried to reopen the case several times over the decades, hoping for a lead, a confession, or a DNA trace. But Charles had left nothing behind. Just silence. And silence doesn't talk back. To this day, his story remains one of the most mysterious disappearances in American true crime history. A double murder with a missing suspect. A house with no screams, no struggle, just cold meat wrapped and labeled like groceries. And a son who melted into shadow. Some say Charles Rogers never truly disappeared. They say he's still out there, older now, maybe watching the world through a different face. A man who walks past newspaper stands and pauses when he sees old black and white headlines. A man who turns off his lights before the news ends. Who never answers the door. Who opens his refrigerator late at night and remembers, not with guilt, but precision. Time has a strange way of turning facts into folklore, especially when blood soaks the pages. The case of Charles Rogers didn't just disappear with the closing of the file. It bled outward, like an old stain that refuses to fade. In the decades since that brutal summer day in 1965, the Icebox murders became a legend whispered among Houston detectives, true crime enthusiasts, and those who still drive past the street where the house once stood. But for some, the mystery was too loud to ignore. In the early 2000s, a cold case researcher named Michael Feeney reopened the file on his own time. Feeney wasn't a cop. He was a forensic historian, someone obsessed with vanished people and the gaps they left behind. The Icebox murders were his white whale, not because of the brutality, but because of the silence that followed it. Feeney was convinced that Charles Rogers hadn't just vanished randomly. He believed Charles had been preparing to disappear for years. He started piecing together a timeline no one had fully explored. Through declassified military records and archival job postings, Feeney discovered that Charles Rogers had been employed as a contract pilot and radio technician during the 1950s. One of his assignments had taken him to the jungles of Central America, where Cold War operations were being quietly carried out. Feeney noted a pattern. Charles would be gone for months at a time, unreachable, and then return to Houston quieter, more withdrawn, always alone. One diary entry from a distant cousin described Charles at a family event in 1959. He barely spoke, refused photographs, but spent an entire hour sketching a map of South America in the corner of a napkin. When asked why, he simply said, "I might have to go there someday." By 1964, Charles had stopped working completely. He rarely left the attic. No mail came for him. No visitors. But the neighbors occasionally reported strange deliveries. Seal crates marked with international stamps. One even claimed to see Charles digging in the backyard at night, then covering the ground with a tarp and flower pots. Feeney proposed a theory. Charles Rogers had created an escape cache, a buried collection of documents, currency, and supplies, and he'd practiced, again and again, for the moment he'd flee. But what triggered the final act? What snapped? Feeney believed the answer lay in Fred and Edwina's bank records. In the weeks before the murder, Fred had attempted to cash a large check, one tied to an inheritance Charles believed was his. The check was blocked, but it led to a confrontation. According to one private interview, a neighbor claimed to have overheard shouting inside the house the night before the bodies were discovered. One voice sharp, accusing. The other, cold, final. Then silence. Feeney speculated that the murders weren't just rage. They were premeditated removal. A surgical erasure of everything tying Charles to that house, to that name, to that past. The dismemberment, the cleaning, the arrangement in the refrigerator. Not done in panic. Done in ritual. It wasn't about hiding the crime. It was about sealing it, closing the door behind him, as if Charles believed that by slicing the roots, he could finally grow somewhere else. Feeney took his research a step further. He hired a forensic artist to age progress Charles's last known photo. Then he sent it, along with fingerprints and DNA, to embassies and law enforcement agencies across South and Central America. Nothing came back. No matches. No interest. No one wanted to reopen a file nearly half a century old. But that didn't stop the sightings. In 2012, a retired oil worker in Paraguay claimed he'd met a man in the 1980s who fit Charles's description. The man went by Carlos, spoke fluent English and French, and claimed to have once worked for the government, though he never specified which one. Carlos lived alone, never left his home during the day, and always seemed to be waiting for something. Then one night, he vanished. Left everything behind. Clothes, books, even food still on the stove. Gone. And that old name started to surface again. Rogers. The story couldn't be confirmed, but added another thread to the web. Back in Houston, a younger generation started rediscovering the Icebox murders through podcasts, YouTube videos, and true crime forums. Some believed Charles died shortly after fleeing. Others believed he reinvented himself again and again, like a ghost moving between lives, each one quieter than the last. In 2015, exactly 50 years after the murders, the Houston Police Department quietly released a digitized version of the case file. Over 500 pages of photographs, handwritten notes, diagrams, and witness statements. The file reopened old wounds and sparked new theories. One user on a true crime forum claimed the murders were part of a larger pattern. Unexplained deaths of elderly parents across several states during the mid-60s, always with one adult child unaccounted for. Another theorist believed Charles was part of a sleeper cell, a Cold War-era agent who had to erase his past to activate his future. But the truth? Still locked in that attic. Still buried in that fridge. Still missing. And then something strange happened. A new homeowner on Driscoll Street, where the old house had stood, reported a bizarre incident. While renovating the garage, they found a small metal box sealed in concrete. Inside, an old black and white photograph of Fred and Edwina, a torn map of Venezuela, and a single brass key with the number 34 etched into it. No one could explain the contents. The photo wasn't known to the family. The map was incomplete, and the key matched no known lock. Some believe it was a prank, a planted object meant to stir up the legend again, but others weren't so sure. What if it was real? What if Charles left behind a breadcrumb? One final message for anyone still watching. A way of saying, I got away, I had a plan, and you'll never find me. The new homeowners donated the box to a local museum. The key, however, was lost in transit, just like Charles. Today, few remain who remember the Icebox murders firsthand. But in the right corner of the city, if you ask the right people, they'll still talk about it. The attic, the fridge, the silence, the house where the floor never creaked, where a man climbed down from above and became a ghost with a pilot's license, a ghost fluent in silence, a ghost named Charles Rogers. And if you're ever in Houston, walk down Driscoll Street, wait for nightfall, and listen closely. Some swear that if you stand beside the patch of grass where the old kitchen once sat, you can still hear the hum of a refrigerator that isn't there. Cold, constant, and humming just below a voice that whispers. Don't look in the attic. This is the fifth story in tonight's journey through true crime mysteries that never found an ending. So lean back, close your eyes, and let the darkness carry you to the silent fields of Minnesota. It was the night of May 13th, 2008. A quiet Tuesday like any other. 19-year-old Brandon Swanson had just finished celebrating the end of the spring semester. Friends, laughter, small town streets. He was heading home to Marshall, Minnesota, his little world surrounded by cornfields and gravel roads that twisted to the countryside like old, forgotten veins. He never made it home. Sometime after midnight, Brandon's car veered off the road into a shallow ditch. He wasn't hurt, not shaken, just calm, collected. He pulled out his phone and called the one person we all turn to when we're lost, his parents. He told them where he thought he was, just outside the town of Lind. His mom and dad got in the car and drove out, headlights searching in the dark, scanning the shoulders of the road. He stayed on the line with them, describing landmarks they should be seeing. But they couldn't find him. He said he could see their headlights in the distance. They flashed theirs. He didn't see them. Somehow, they were in two different places. Brandon, thinking he could find a better meeting point, said he'd walk toward a bar in Lind. He kept the phone to his ear, talking with his dad. A gentle conversation. Quiet words shared between father and son in the stillness of early morning. He described fences, trees, a faint sound of water flowing nearby. And then, after 47 long minutes on the call, he said, "Oh, no." The line went silent. No scream, no crash, just two simple words. And then, nothing. His parents tried calling back, over and over. But Brandon never picked up again. By morning, his car was found, nowhere near Lind, but closer to the town of Taunton. He'd been over 20 miles off from where he believed he was. That was the first mystery. Search teams arrived. Volunteers combed the area. Bloodhounds were brought in. They followed Brandon scent along the gravel roads, through the tall grass, down to the banks of the Yellow Medicine River. Then the trail stopped. No phone, no body, no sign of struggle. Just nothing, like the earth itself had swallowed him. People still wonder, did he fall into the river that night? Or was someone else out there, watching, waiting? The official theory leans toward a tragic accident. But without a body, the whispers continue. And in small towns, whispers carry far. His parents, Brian and Annette, never stopped searching. Not then, not now. They lobbied for change because for too long, police had waited to investigate, thinking he'd just run off like so many others. But Brandon wasn't like the others. And his final words weren't the kind of goodbye that comes with running away. Thanks to them, Minnesota passed Brandon's law, requiring immediate action for missing adults. Still no answers. Only questions buried beneath fields of corn and tall prairie grass. Sometimes, late at night, drivers say they see something in the distance on those back roads, a flicker of movement, a shape too pale to be real, and footsteps echoing where no one walks anymore. They call it wind. But the parents of Brandon Swanson know better. Because some things don't disappear without leaving something behind. Even if it's just a whisper, or the sound of footsteps in the corn. Tonight, you and I are walking deeper, into the darkness, back into the tall grass of western Minnesota, where echoes linger and the truth refuses to rise. This is part 2 of the story of Brandon Swanson, and the mystery that swallowed him whole. After his voice vanished on the phone that night, after that haunting, "Oh no," his parents waited in the dark with headlights shining like lighthouses in the fog, hoping, praying. But morning arrived, and there was still no sign of Brandon. The official search began slowly. Authorities initially treated it like a case of a teenage boy blowing off steam, maybe hiding out. But his parents knew better. He wasn't that kind of kid. Responsible. Kind, level-headed. They insisted something was wrong. And when the police finally listened, it was already too late. His green Chevy Lumina was found, quietly resting in a ditch near Taunton, far from where Brandon had said he was on the phone. The car was undamaged. Keys gone. Lights off. Door closed. Everything neat, like he'd parked it there on purpose. But he hadn't, because by then he was gone. And that is where the trail begins to blur. Bloodhounds picked up Brandon's scent from the car, followed it along the gravel road, up and down the ditches, and into the brush. It wound toward the Yellow Medicine River. The dogs tracked his footsteps down to the edge of the water, but then the scent just stopped. Some believed he may have slipped and drowned. Others said the current was shallow that night. Calm. There would have been signs. A splash. Something. But nothing was ever found. Divers searched. Boats scanned the river with sonar. Planes flew overhead. But no trace of Brandon. And then came the stories. A farmer said his cows were restless that night. Another neighbor reported dogs barking near the cornfields, louder than usual, like something had stirred in the dark. And someone else claimed to hear a voice faint, almost like a cry carried on the wind. But the land gave up no secrets. His phone was never found. His wallet untouched. No footprints past the river. No torn clothing. No struggle. It was as if the world had simply let go of him. And in the stillness that followed, all his family had left was silence. But they refused to give up. Brandon's parents turned grief into movement. They pushed for reform. And within a year, Minnesota passed Brandon's law, requiring police to treat missing adult reports with the same urgency as those of children. No more waiting. No more assumptions. Because by the time someone realizes something's wrong, it's often already too late. Search teams returned year after year, summer after summer, winter after frozen winter. But Brandon was never found. And so the cornfields grew back. The grass reached the sky. The fences weathered with time. And that stretch of country road where he vanished became just another mile marker in a long map of mystery. But some say he's still out there. Not alive, not gone, but somewhere in between. Locals talk of a pale figure, seen from a distance, walking along the side of the road in early morning mist, always heading in one direction, toward the river. Truckers whisper hearing a voice over the CB radio, crackling in and out, calling for help in a tone that's far too calm for the panic it should carry. And some say, when the moon is low and the cornfields sway without wind, you can hear footsteps crunching softly in the gravel behind you, just before the silence returns. People don't disappear like that, not in real life. And yet, Brandon did. One moment, he was there, talking to his dad like everything would be okay. The next, he was a ghost in the cornfields, lost of the night. So if you ever find yourself driving those back roads near Taunton, and your radio cuts out, and your headlights flicker for just a second, slow down. Listen carefully, because in the whisper of the wind, and in the hush between thoughts, you just might hear someone still walking, still searching for the road home, and still trying to tell us what really happened. After, oh no, you've come with me through the empty roads, the long cornfields, and the frozen silence that followed the disappearance of Brandon Swanson. And now, we come to the end of his trail. But the strange thing about endings is that sometimes there aren't any. They just stop, just like the sound on the other end of the phone line. Let's go back to that night in 2008. The sun had set hours ago. The world was asleep. And Brandon Swanson was standing alone in the dark, somewhere between Marshall and Taunton, his voice steady, his step slow, and his parents listening on the other end of the line. He didn't sound afraid. He didn't sound lost. Not at first. He spoke calmly, thoughtfully, describing fences and gravel, fields and lights in the distance. He believed he was near Lind, walking toward it. But later, they realized he was miles away in the wrong direction. How could that be? How could someone who grew up in that very area not know where he was? Maybe he was disoriented. Maybe he was misled by the quiet. Or maybe there was something else. Something just out of view. At 2:30 a.m., his voice shifted. Just one moment, one breath, before he said the words that would haunt his parents forever. Oh no! And then the call ended. No scream, no splash, no static, just a void. And it never rang again. Some believe Brandon fell into a hole, into the river, into the earth itself. Others believe he was taken, not by something human, but by the land. That night, temperatures dropped. It was cold, dangerous. But Brandon had been walking with purpose, not panic. No sign of distress until the very end. When investigators combed the fields, they found nothing. No footprints in the mud, no torn grass, no signs of struggle or wildlife. Even the dogs, trained to trace scent through snow and water, lost his trail completely at the riverbank. It was as if he'd stepped through a doorway that no one else could see. A few months later, someone claimed they saw a figure out by Porter, just a shape near the road, vanishing into the corn when headlights hit it. Another driver said they saw a young man walking barefoot down a gravel road. He looked confused. Then he disappeared into the ditch. But every lead ended in the same place. Nowhere. And so the myth began. The boy who vanished without a trace. The voice that left behind only silence. But there's something else. Brandon's father once said that silence isn't the hardest part. It's the waiting. The way the night seems to stretch longer when you don't know where your child is. And even now, years later, they still leave the porch light on sometimes, just in case. You see, this isn't just a story about a missing person. It's about a hole in time, a gap between two sentences, a pause that never resolves. It's about all the places we go that we shouldn't, and the ones we can't seem to return from. There's a field out there where nothing grows quite right. Some say the air feels colder, even on a summer evening. And if you stand in that field just before dawn and close your eyes, you might hear gravel shifting, as if someone is walking behind you. You might hear the low murmur of a voice carried on the breeze. And maybe, if the wind is still, you might hear it again. Oh no! Brandon's story ends without an ending, and that's what makes it linger. He's still 19 in every photo, still missing in every file, still walking in every parent's nightmare, and still, somewhere out there, beneath the stars of Minnesota, part of him walks on, because the land never gave him back, and the road never said where he went. So sleep lightly tonight, listener, and if your phone rings in the early hours and you don't recognize the number, maybe don't answer, because some voices once lost are still looking to be found, only here on Mr. DarXnights. Good night.